collapse. So I'm a little loath to lean on this, but thank you guys for coming out. I appreciate it. This is the book that I have written. It's called The Frost in Hell, the true story of the Petersham Butcher of 1875. So what I always ask people as I get started is, quick show of hands, who's ever been to Petersham before? All right, that's a really good ratio. 2 out of 15 is not too bad. So Petersham is a small town in central Massachusetts. I grew up there. It's my hometown, even though I live in Boxford now. I'm a Petersham boy. My kids are Boxford kids, but I'm a Petersham boy. Petersham, when I was growing up, the thing they always used to tell us is Petersham is the second biggest town in the state area-wise. Plymouth being first. Plymouth still considers itself a town. So it's pretty big that way. When I was growing up, they had a population of about 900, about 250 of which were nuns. There were 3 nunneries in town. So it's about 1,000 now, and the nunneries are gone. There's one of them, but they're down. But the point of all that is to tell you we have a very big town with very few people. So we've got a house here, and then we got a house here, and then we got a house here, and there's not. I'll put it to you this way. The town that we're in right now is a metropolis compared to the town that I grew up in. Interesting little tidbit, by the way. In 1733, it was in April of 1733, 67 men, proprietors, petitioned the state to make Petersham an official town, and it did ultimately pass, and in 1754 it got incorporated. One of those 67 was Jeremiah Purley from Boxford, Massachusetts. So how's that for a little local connection? The thing about Petersham is it's a very small town, and not a lot happens there. So I had written a book a couple of years ago called Ack and Ashes about the Great Fire in Nantucket in 1846. One of my challenges there was, can I write a book? I'd never written a book before. I didn't know what I was doing, but I always wanted to read a book about that story, and no one ever wrote it. So finally I said, all right, I'm going to take a shot at it. Whatever anyone thinks of that book, I did it. So now I got the bug, I want to write another book. I said, well, what about my hometown? Is there any way that I could write a book about something that happened in my hometown when nothing ever happens in my hometown? And if you think I mean nothing, there's 2 claims to fame in Petersham. 1787, Shays' Rebellion ends in Petersham. General Lincoln routs Shays on a very cold February, in a very cold February blizzard. Shays ends up on the run heading to Vermont. The rest is history. The Constitution is verified, and boom, we're on our way now. We need a strong central government that has an armed forces is the lesson there. So Petersham has a tie to the history of the country. Fast forward to 1950, thereabouts, 1953 exactly, and we have the Worcester tornado, which kills 90-something people, depending on who you listen to. That starts in Petersham. Between 1787 and 1953, this is a farming town. It's a very quiet town, religious town, and people do their farming, people go to church service, and people mind their own business. And they don't want you meddling in their business, and they're not going to meddle in yours. So not a lot happens. No one's ever heard of Petersham. We got 2 here that have ever been there, and that's saying something. So, but there was one thing that did happen, and it was in 1875, and I thought to myself, well, if I'm ever going to write a book about a town that no one's ever heard of, what could I sell them on? How about a juicy murder? I like reading these stories, especially when it's long in the past, right? I don't want to read about Aaron Hernandez particularly. That one's a little fresh for me. But this is in 1875. So when I was a kid, 9 or 10 years old, one of the town historians, quasi-historian, gave a little lecture on 5 things that happened in town that were pretty cool. And one of the things he talked about was there was a guy, hence the cover of this book, who was from Petersham, who found his way into that noose. And before the state dropped the trap and executed him, they said, do you have any last words? And he, Mr. Samuel J. Frost, proudly announced, yeah, there'll be a frost in hell tonight. And down he went, and that was it. And so I waited till the speech was over, and I went up to Larry, and I said, I tugged on his shoulder, what's the story of that guy? I don't know, he killed somebody, but that was his last words. Like, Larry knew the last words part, but nobody really knew the story. I didn't think much of it. A couple years later, the woman who was the real historian in town, I got up the nerve to ask her, and she said, you know, I don't really know that either. I know the last words part, but I don't know. That's it, end of it. Well, fast forward 30 years, and that little itch that was in my head when I was a kid comes back. Could I write a book about Petersham? Well, what was the thing that led to There'll Be a Frost in Hell Tonight? I want to know. What's beautiful about what happened in between when I was 9 years old and when I'm 29? My wife and dad. They invented the internet. Could not have written this book without it. You'll see why in a few minutes. But now I have resources that I could never have had before, and I can figure out, I think, a little bit as to what happens with this story. So that's how we get to here. Now, what happens, right? July 4th of all days, it's the 99th anniversary of the country. Everybody's getting up, getting ready to make plans to go out and celebrate with loved ones, except for one guy who's making plans to kill a loved one. And it sounds like a joke or the beginning of a joke, but there's no punchline here. Two men walk into a barn on the morning of July 4th and only one of them comes out. That's what happens. So what happened in the barn? Therein lies the rub, right? Because two guys walked into a barn. So either somebody killed somebody in cold-blooded murder or somebody was defending himself and had no choice but to take out that other person. By the way, that other person just so happens to be Samuel J. Frost's brother-in-law, who was also Samuel J. Frost's best friend and lived on the farm in Petersham with Samuel J. Frost and Samuel J. Frost's wife, the sister of Franklin P. Town, who is now the deceased on July 4th, 1875. So think about that for a second. Whatever else you don't know about this case, a guy kills his brother and then goes into the house to sit with that deceased guy's sister, who happens to be his wife, and wow, what a tangled web we weave, right? So where does that leave us? Well, there's basically three people on the farm. One of them is involved in the altercation, the other one's no longer with us, and then there's a third person, and it's the wife. So what I always tell people when I start talking about this story is, look, there's been a lot of murders, and there's been a lot of homicides, and 1875 was no different than 2019 or any other year. People were, in fact, when he first ends up in court, there's three other people with him that have committed murders or homicides. So these go on all the time. We've been over this, and everybody knows it. Why does this story capture the imagination of everybody? Well, it's for two reasons. One is what he does to cover up the crime, which I can only talk about sparingly, or else my wife is going to go, damn you, because I always give away too much. But the other and the more important aspect of it is the wife. And that's who I'm really interested in here. So 1875 is the year. If this happened in 2019, it's going to be pretty obvious what happens, right? The wife is going to be called to court. She doesn't have much say in it, and she's going to have to tell you what she knows. Well, in 1875, that's not quite the case. In fact, had this happened 5 years earlier, there would probably not even be a book, because they didn't even have written rules as to what's supposed to happen in a case like this, because up until 1870, it was pretty clear that a woman's first and foremost responsibilities were to her husband before they were to the state. In 1870, they actually put into law what would happen in a circumstance like this, and it's unbelievable that they wrote it 5 years earlier, because it directly pertains to this case, and it's the first time it's ever actually used in court. The wife will be asked two things in court. One, do you want to testify against your husband? If she says no, thank you, and see you later. If she says yes, you understand that you don't have to, number one, and number two, you also understand that anything he has told you will not be discussed here. You can only talk about things you've heard from other people. You cannot talk about conversations with your husband. Why is that? Because in 1875, that bond between a husband and wife was considered sacrosanct, and you could not violate that even if it meant somebody got away with murder. So the big question everybody in Massachusetts wants to know is, what did she know, and what is she going to talk about? No one knows. So July 4th, 1875, a man ends up dead. October 13th, 1875, there's a court in the Worcester County Courthouse that's getting ready to have a trial, and there's a little lady who's in that courtroom in the front row, and that would be Carrie Frost, who, by the way, just as a point of reference again, Carrie Frost and Samuel Frost met in 1866 in Haverhill, Massachusetts. Samuel was a shoe cutter at one of the mills, and she was a shoe stitcher. They got married a year later in West Newbury, as a matter of fact. So a lot of North Shore connections here, if you can believe that. In fact, West Newbury still has their marriage certificate online in the town hall, which is in the book. So there you go with that. Fast forward to 10 years later, and now she's in a courthouse. Everybody wants to know, what is she going to do? I don't want to give away too much. You're going to have to read the book, but I can tell you this. She takes the stand, and they say, are you willing to testify against your husband? And the first two words out of her mouth is, yes, indeed. So now I can also tell you that there is a noose on the cover of this book. So I think you get the idea. But the question is, what does she know, and what can she prove? I can tell you this. They could never have gotten him, I don't believe, without her. I can tell you this. When he put his head in this noose, there was one person he was not pleased with at that time, and that was her. Because he knew, I think, that when he did this, there was only one person that could cook him, and he knew she loved him, and he also knew sort of what the law was. And so he was not expecting her to be nearly as forthcoming in court as she was. She talked for 2 days, 2 straight days, which was a long time in 1875. She's got 4 kids at home from 1866 to 1875. They have 4 kids. They live in 9 different cities, some as far as Wisconsin. She had had a very tough life with him, but she loved him. All indications are she was as committed to him as any woman was in that time. And he had every reason to believe she was going to be a loyal wife. He was in for a rude awakening, as it turned out. So this becomes the trial of the year, not only in Massachusetts, but I would argue across the country. I heard a young lady in the back say that she was just recently in California. Well, I can tell you this. I grew up in Petersham. Petersham never, ever finds its way into the Boston Globe under no circumstances. It's been on the front page of the Boston Herald once. That was the Worcester tornado, and it just said it started in Petersham. Fine, whatever. But in 1875, this was on the front page of every newspaper, not only in Massachusetts, and the big one in Massachusetts at that time was the Worcester Daily Spy, not the Boston Globe. The Globe was relatively new, but they had it. But I'll just show you one page from the book. I know you can't see it particularly, but that's the San Francisco Chronicle. And that's page 1 of the San Francisco Chronicle, and the headline is, "A Thrilling Tragedy, an Atrocious Crime in Petersham, Massachusetts." So nobody has ever heard of Petersham, nobody's ever been to Petersham, but in 1875 it was on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle, it was on the front page of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, it was on the front page of the Washington Examiner, it was on the front page of every newspaper in the country because of what Samuel J. Frost did on July 4th, 1875 in Petersham. If I haven't hooked you yet, then I haven't done my job. But that's what was interesting to me as I went about this. Now, a couple other little things, I guess, that I'll try and sell you on. I don't know how much anybody follows the news. I don't care what anybody's views on the death penalty are. It's irrelevant to me whether you're for it or against it. But understand this. This young lady's birthday is May 26th. That's funny because she shares a birthday with Samuel J. Frost's death day. Samuel J. Frost is executed May 26th, 1876. Kind of interesting, right? If you think about it for a second. He commits a murder on July 4th, 1875. He's put to death May 26th, 1876. Think about that for a second. So from the time of the murder to the time of the execution, we're talking less than 11 months. We have a murder, we have an investigation, we have an arrest, we have a trial, we have an appeal to a governor, we have a setup and execution, and we have a carry out and execution. All of that in less than 11 months. Now, why is that relevant today? I'm not saying what's right or wrong, but I don't know if anybody knows this. Last week in Alabama, a young man was set to be executed. A half an hour before he was to be executed, the governor issued a stay of execution because while in prison, that guy converted to the Muslim religion, and they couldn't get an imam there in time, and so he's been stayed. Whatever you think of that, irrelevant. Why I bring him up is he committed a homicide in 1986. It's now 2019, and we have yet to put him to death. Things were a little different in 1875. In fact, in this particular case, the assumption was that he would be put down in the fall, but the governor rushed it. Let's get this on. So the governor had a couple of days in order to sign the paperwork, and he literally waited in his office and said, "Give me that paperwork." One of the reasons why this becomes so interesting and so significant for that guy is, and I only go into this a little bit in the book, but there was a trial a couple of years earlier in Boston. It was about a guy named Jesse Pomeroy, a kid, who at 10 years old killed somebody went to reform school, came back, apparently killed, it depends on who you believe and what you believe, but killed at least 4 more people. He became a national story in 73, his trial, and then in 74, the question was, will he be put to death? And the governor at that time had a hard time deciding what to do and ultimately didn't sign his death warrant because the kid was a kid. According to the eyes, he was just too young. That was the death warrant of the political career of that governor. He ended up losing. Governors were elected on a yearly basis at that time. He was run out immediately. It was the Boston Post who continually drove the story that he's afraid to put a murderer to death. What kind of governor is he? And he got booted, and the guy that came in gets Samuel J. Frost on his lap. So when Samuel J. Frost appeals to the governor for some clemency, not only is he not in a real good mood, he still has the Pomeroy case to deal with because the previous governor didn't issue any ruling on it. He just left it. So it's still falling on that governor to decide what to do. Ultimately, he is recommended by the governor's council to execute him, and he does not. So he knows in the back of his mind that he's not going to kill the kid. So Samuel J. Frost has about this much chance of getting any sort of stay from the governor in 1875. I also think there's some, I wouldn't say classism, but there was a big thing that a lot of us in Western Mass know. If you're outside of 495, you're not really in Massachusetts. Well, the governor's office is in Boston, and this guy was in Worcester, and I can be big tough guy with Worcester because what do I care? We'll deal with the kid in Boston a little differently, and that is what happened. I think if the roles were reversed, who's to say what happened? But back to the news for a second. One of the other things that's really, to me, really interesting about this, that historian, pseudo-historian that I told you, that mentioned the last words. The other thing he mentioned in this case is that Frost was the last man ever hanged in Massachusetts. Not true, but he was the last man ever hanged in Worcester County. So we have a first and a last with little Samuel J. Frost from Petersham. There is a situation in his trial where, for the first time in the history of Massachusetts, a defense attorney asks for a change of venue due to the publicity of the case. That tells you how popular the murder in Petersham was. So that had never been done before. It was, in fact, so unusual that the Attorney General, who, by the way, is the one trying the case, think about that in 1875. So think about Moore Healey trying Aaron Hernandez. That would be rather unusual, right? Well, in 1875, Attorney General Train, who a few years prior had turned down an appointment to the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court wasn't then what it is now, but that gives you an idea what people across the country thought of him. He's trying this case along with the district attorney in Worcester County, but Train is sort of the driving force. When the defense attorney for Frost, who was court appointed, gets up and says, we're going to have to request a change of venue, the 2 judges who sit on the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court look at the Attorney General and say, what's the legal ruling on this? And the Attorney General goes, so they had to hear it out, and you'll see if you look at the book how that all plays out. But so that was a first. It was a last. It was the last hanging in Worcester County. I won't get too much into that because it's chapter 1 of the book. However, what I just told you, if I haven't hooked you, if you do get the book and I haven't hooked you by the end of chapter 1, stop reading because I haven't done my job, but I'm pretty sure you won't. They don't stop executing people in Massachusetts till the 1950s, and they don't stop hanging them till right around the turn of the century, 1899. The electric chair is finally invented, and it finally comes north, and they get one. So what happens at that point is the electric chair is put in state police barracks, and Worcester County didn't have one at the time, so they have to come east in order to be executed. End of executions in Worcester County after 1899, but between 1875 and 1899, they execute, I want to say it's like 7 people, I think, but not there. And there's a reason why, and it's Samuel J. Frost, and that's all I can tell you. So, in the end, what most struck me about this, and the question, there was 2 questions that I wanted to answer. One is, can I write a book about Petersham that anybody who doesn't know Petersham might care about? And as my wife will attest, when the book first came out, I got an email from a woman in Cincinnati whose college roommate lived in Petersham for a couple of years. And just randomly, she somehow Googled Petersham, and this came up, and she got the book and said, oh my God. And what just killed me, I love the fact that someone in Cincinnati who doesn't know anything about my little town read the book, and I enjoyed that. So that made me feel good. But the other thing is, in the history of the Commonwealth, by 1875, there'd only been 299 executions. Now, while that may sound like a high number, remember, first 100 of those are for two reasons only: witchcraft and piracy. One of the, you know the witchcraft story, etc. And then pirates. Those were the two big threats. It wasn't until, I don't know, 50 years after that where they started doing rape and murder as public executions. So your number goes down to about 200 in 175 years, and just over one a year, basically. So what would make a guy from little old Petersham that no one's ever heard of be one of the chosen few, for lack of a better term? There is a reason, and it's not just that he killed his brother-in-law, it's what he does to his brother-in-law. And again, I'm not going to get too into it, but I will tell you this, it's unusual in this sense. Picture this as the courtroom. Sitting there are two judges. At the time when you had a capital case in Massachusetts, they wouldn't allow one. It had to be two judges in case one judge was biased and whatever. It couldn't be from the county, so it wasn't Worcester County. So you bring a judge from out in the Berkshires named Justice Colt. He comes east, and then you bring a judge from Boston who is, I would argue, I don't know, one of the 50 greatest citizens this Commonwealth has ever produced. He's an absolute Civil War hero. He was shot at and injured several times in the Civil War, led his men under the most dire of circumstances. He's so great that there's a statue of him outside of the Worcester County Courthouse today. It's the only statue at the Worcester County Courthouse. He's obviously been dead for 150 years. He wasn't from Worcester. There is also a statue of him on the Charles River in Boston. He didn't live there. So you have two statues to the guy at places where he did not live, but he's that impressive. Oh, by the way, there's also a town named after him called Devens. He was Charles Devens. So he's the presiding judge in this case. You've got two of the most impressive judicial minds possible. You've got the Attorney General of the Commonwealth, you've got the District Attorney of the Commonwealth, and then you've got a defense attorney who's court appointed who ends up on the Massachusetts Superior Court a couple of years later, and the other defense counsel appointed by the court only doesn't end up on the Superior Court because his father-in-law dies, and his father-in-law was a railroad magnate. He becomes a railroad magnate, becomes one of the wealthiest men in Massachusetts at the time of his death. So you've got 6 really impressive people, all of whom have Ivy League educations except for one, Judge Colt, who went to Williams. Not exactly a slouch, right? You've got 6 guys sitting up here or right there that have Ivy League educations, and they're there for one reason: a guy that nobody could ever have thought they would ever care about, ever know about. Most people in Petersham had never met him. He'd only blown in a couple of years earlier. They bought the farm in Petersham, no pun intended. They bought the farm in Petersham in December of '73, didn't move there until March of 1874. He commits the crime in July of 1875. Most people knew his wife. Why? She was a church-going, God-fearing woman, and she never missed church. In fact, July 4th, 1875 happened to be on a Sunday. It's not coincidence that the murder's done on that day. There's a number of reasons, but one of which is she's not going to be around for a couple hours. In fact, 2 men go into a barn and only one comes out. One then says to his wife, "Why don't I hitch up the team, get you ready for church?" Gets her and a couple of the kids ready, and then off they go. Not a smart move. He'd never done that before and had never done it after. So when she takes the stand in court, she's asked about that. She said, "I found that kind of unusual. That doesn't do him well." It also doesn't do him well that he never went to church with her. 2 reasons. One is nobody knows him, so he now becomes the boogeyman. Who is this guy that nobody knows? Number one. Number two, 1875, this country and this Commonwealth is still a God-fearing land, and they don't quite look the same on people that don't believe that way as they do the people that do. And when you're on the stand and your wife believes in God and is telling what she says is the truth, and you're on the stand telling what you believe in the truth, but you don't go to church, not awesome, right? So that's the predicament that he was facing. I will tell you this, he does ultimately take the stand in his own defense. In the newspaper the next day, the Worcester Daily Spy says he did very well, and he seemed very believable. He tells a wildly different story than what the prosecution puts forth, but the papers say that he was a very believable guy. I will also tell you this about Samuel J. Frost, and not much is known about him. He was a nobody, and that's just how it was. But When he first gets arrested, he goes to Barre, Massachusetts, the next town over. That's where they had the jail. That's where the deputy sheriff was. And a week later, he has to have his first appearance in public court in Fitchburg. So he has to take the train from Barre up to Fitchburg, Massachusetts. When he gets off the train in Fitchburg, there's over 300 people on the platform. He just walks off and looks over and waves at them because he just thought there were people there. He didn't realize they were there to see the boogeyman. And what they saw when the boogeyman walked off the train, because everybody wanted to know who's that guy from Petersham that did that thing. And I can't get into that. What they saw was a guy about this tall. They had pictured him as being a hulking giant of a man who wielded great axes and could do massive amounts of harm. They saw a man about 5'5", about 110 pounds, with the brownest teeth anybody had ever seen, and when he flashed them, everybody recoiled. So that's who Samuel J. Frost was, and that's what the public's first impression of the man was, but their second impression was that he told a pretty good story when he was in court. So ultimately the question is, who do they believe? Do they believe the wife or do they believe Samuel? There's 30 other witnesses, and some are for reasons that are necessary, some are for show reasons, and some are, we just gotta have witnesses. So that's what they did. But it ultimately comes down to a case of her or him, who do you believe? And it's not nearly as clear cut as you might think. So that's the story. I will tell you one last thing, and I don't know whether people ever care about this or not, but when you write books, one of the things you do, I want primary material, and how can I find out about Petersham? There was no papers in Petersham then, there's no papers in Petersham now, no primary sources, right? Samuel didn't leave a diary. So how am I gonna find out about this? And doing some Google searches or whatever, I came upon a site sort of randomly that said there was a 37-page document about the trial, and I thought, wow, if I could somehow get my hands on that, I might have something. But as luck would have it, it was a pay site, and it was only a pay site for professional resource research centers, which obviously I'm not, and I don't even know how to do this or whatever. Some of all the Worcester Daily Spies are in a place in Worcester called the Antiquarian Society, and I was there looking through the papers one day, and a young kid said to me, what are you working on? And we got to talking just briefly. He said, oh, that sounds interesting. I said, it'd be more interesting. I could get my hands on this document, but I don't know. I go, what is it? And, I sort of explained to him, and I can see the kid's like me. I plant a bug, and he's got an itch, and now he wants to scratch it. So he goes, let me see what I can do. He emails me a day later and says, nah, I know what that is. That ain't going to happen. I said, oh, okay, no problem. I got an email 3 days later. Got it. And I said, you got what? He goes, I don't have it, but I know where it is. It's at the Social Law Library in Boston. I know why. I had to do something sort of nefarious to figure this out. Don't ask questions, whatever. Fine. I said, oh, great. I said, do I have that? He goes, yeah, go there, give my name, blah, blah, blah. So I go there to get the 37-page document, and when I sign it out, it's a 737-page document. The thing got cut. The margin of the thing that they posted had gotten cut, and I got this volume, and it literally, I know this will sound stupid, but when the guy gave it to me, he did do that in dust, because nobody touched that since 1876. And what it was, talk about a different time and a different world, it was handwritten by the Attorney General himself with a note explaining this is the trial of Samuel J. Frost. They did it for all capital cases because they wanted to make sure the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed. So when it was over and when the session was over, he wrote down, or whoever got the assignment, but Train had it in this case, and he had written down everything. So why I tell you that is, if you decide to read this book, I would be honored if you do. One of the questions that comes up, and she loves when I point this out, but when my wife read the book for the first time, she said, I love the book, but you know that didn't happen, right? I know you embellished that. And that was the best compliment that I could get, because not only is it not embellished, and I'll give you a hint, at some point Samuel J. Frost lets out a humongous belly laugh. He throws his head back and he laughs out loud at a time when he was not supposed to be laughing. And she said, I know you sort of embellished. That's from the trial. There was 3 people there when that happened, and all 3 of them said that happened, and almost gave verbatim stories on that. So there's 2 things in here that I've had people tell me that, but you couldn't possibly know that. It's all from the trial transcript. You're just going to have to take my word on that. I quote as much as I can and explain to you where everything comes from, But there is nothing in here made up. In fact, there's one thing that I wanted to put in here because I'm sure it happened, but I couldn't source it, and I ended up taking it out. It's not the end of the world, but it bugs me, but whatever. So the good news is I found the trial transcript, and that made this book unbelievably better, I think. The one that got away, because there's always one that gets away. At the same time, I randomly found that website that said there was a 37-page transcript. I also found a website dedicated to the Worcester State Prison, which had been destroyed in 1973. It had become old and decrepit, and they finally tore it down. But there's a blog site where people could come, memories of the Worcester State Prison, and all these people, oh, I remember vacationing there for a couple of years, or my uncle did time there. And so I was just reading them one night as I was frustrated. It was late. My wife was probably in bed. And then I see it. And it's like 15 entries in. And the guy says, my great-great-grandfather was hanged in that thing. And he signed it, David Frost. And I said, holy smokes. And he said, I have the execution portrait back in the day. I don't know when they stopped doing this either, but before photography, and photography was around but wasn't that prevalent at the time, they would do portraits of the man being executed, and they would do it very rosily and whatever, and he said he had that, and he also had letters from him. The only letters that I would think it could possibly be is when he was in prison, even though he had issues with her, he also knew he needed to get a hold of her before the trial. He wrote letters to his wife, and I'm assuming those are the letters that he had, which I would absolutely love to get my hands on. However, as I told you, it's the one that got away. His name, again, was David Frost. Good luck Googling David Frost, right? So I tried everything I could possibly imagine, including I have a radio show in Boston, so I do not like doing this, but I put out the call, look, if anybody knows who this might be, and I did get several leads, and none of them did pan out, and I never did get to see, that portrait should be in the Petersham Historical Society, and I would love to see what they did with it. And I would love to see those letters. There's one in particular that's pretty famous for me, where he writes to his wife, hey, love to see you and the kids. Also, how about a change of clothes and some huckleberries? And she never responds to him because she's already made up her mind what she's gonna do. But if that's the letter, I would love to see it, but I never could find him. Incidentally, we do have an image of him, but it's not the image I would want. One would be that death portrait would be shown. The other is, and I just gotta find it in there, so bear with me, right before he was executed, and I don't know how this was done, but it was done according to the transcript, so that's him, as drawn by the Worcester West Chronicle when he was on the stand. Full beard, shaggy guy, wore a gray suit with a pin that didn't fit him because he was a thin guy. The day before he was executed, somehow a photographer was allowed into the prison, and he took 3 pictures of him. Frost only agreed to have those 3 pictures taken if, under sworn pains and penalties of death, whatever it was, the deal was that those pictures were to be given to 3 specific people. Those people were never named who they were. According to the reverend that saw Frost to the death chamber, those 3 people did get those pictures, and they've never been seen since. So there was an actual photograph of him, but who knows where it is. Probably in the Petersham landfill, for all I know. Because if one of the people that got it with his wife, I can't imagine she wanted it for much. It could have been his mother. She lived up in New Hampshire at the time. And I will tell you quickly in the book, and then I'll stop talking, I promise. The mother hadn't seen him in several years, but the day before his execution, she visited him in prison. And what's really interesting about that is, look, we live in this age, right? So everybody knows everything about everybody at all times, and there's no secrets and whatever. In 1875, we shouldn't know anything about Samuel J. Frost, really, except that his wife was rather forthcoming, and she kind of wanted everything known, as it turns out. Also, the sheriff of Worcester County, I don't know what his deal was, but I think he liked his name in print. And as a result, he liked to give the Worcester papers access to things that they wanted. And so, really from October 1st until May, he was giving them daily updates on Samuel J. Frost. And they were printing them. And they were printing them with actual quotes from him. I mean, it's remarkable to think the way news had to be gathered back then, but they had really good sources. They used them. I think some of the prison guards were talking to. But everybody wanted to know about the guy. and everybody wanted to know what he was doing. And the sheriff of Worcester County, a guy named A.B.R. Sprague, who was a really interesting guy, absolutely wanted things known. The only thing he would not talk about was what was said between the mother and the son. So we know she was there, but we don't know what happened, because he said that one's off limits, boys. So for what it's worth. But that's why from October 15th, the day he's convicted, to May 26th, we know a lot about him when we shouldn't know anything about him. We even know that the only time he ever complained in that time, once, there was a forger from Worcester who became a bit of a celeb for a brief time because they thought he'd been killed. Turned out he beat feet out west, and they caught him, I think, in Colorado, brought him back. He ended up in the cell next to Frost, and Frost complained about him because he prayed too loud at night. He didn't want to hear any of that garbage. And they said, well, your execution's coming in a month. You don't need to worry about it. It'll be over then. And that's how it went. But that's the only time he ever complained. And we only know that because Sprague told the papers. So that's the level of detail that we have in a case that we really shouldn't know a whole lot about. So I will tell you, there's two things that I haven't really told you about, but that noose plays a much more, there's a reason why that noose is on the cover in 2019. Putting nooses on the cover of a book isn't always the best idea. That's become a symbol, and people don't like seeing it, et cetera, but, and my wife raised that when we did this cover, but I told her, look, that noose is, it's really the reason why we know his story, and to not have that on the cover would make no sense. So that's why it's on there. There's something that happens when that head goes in the noose. That's all I can tell you. So it's pretty interesting, and it's pretty interesting in 1875, and that's what really hooked me on the story. When I saw that, I said, okay, we're going to write this book. And my wife said, oh, man. Because she knew how long it was going to take and the amount of time and effort that would go into it. And by the way, if you don't like this cover, she designed it, so you take it up with her. In fact, she said to me, can I tell this story? She always loves this one. But she said, do you have an idea for the cover? When I did the first book on the Nantucket Fire, I had an idea, which she listened to and said, that's cute, and then did a completely different cover that I loved, right? So for this one, she did, yeah. I said, I don't really. She said, but you must have some ideas. I said, I have some ideas. I'm not sure you're going to love them, but okay. Well, I'm like, his name is, it's Frost in Hell. I don't know, like maybe Jack Frost in hell blowing on his hand. She just goes, she didn't say a word. She just pointed to the door of the office, get out. And an hour later, she said, what do you think of this? And there's a reason why they're called the Berry Half sometimes. She nailed that one. So thank you, honey. Happy Valentine's Day. So anyway, that's the story. True story of the Petersham Butcher. I guess, can I say one more thing? So, it's the true story of the Petersham Butcher of 1875. For what it's worth, the bottom part is sort of my only embellishment of it. He wasn't known as the Petersham Butcher at the time. Nicknames for murderers don't really come into vogue until Jack the Ripper in the 1890s. The Ripper nicknames himself the Ripper, and after him, everybody gets a nickname, right? The smiley face killer, or you can go down the list. He was known as the Petersham Murderer, and all the papers always referred to him as the Petersham Murderer. The headlines always were the Petersham Murderer. One paper, the Athol Transcript, Athol's the next town over from Petersham, once, while listing a series of things, the mutilator, the milk spiller, the bad husband, the butcher, they listed several things, and that one time the phrase the Petersham Butcher appeared. It boggles my mind that they didn't pin it on him at the time, but the very next day they had an article on him and removed that. So they clearly were like, well, that's a little too salacious, which is crazy when you find out what they were printing about the guy. But nobody ever referred to him at that time as that, but I just thought that sounds better than the Petersham Murderer. So that's why he's the Petersham Butcher, for what it's worth. So that's my story. If you're at all interested, she'll have copies back there. Are there any questions, by the way? Anything?